discipline. That's some discipline.
You're listening to Hart Beat Radio.
This is Bob Johnson, live from the studios of Hart Beat Radio, Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Got a really good show for you, great fans of Hart Beat Radio this afternoon. Great to have Jim and George on today.
Yeah, I'm delighted to have both Jim and George, and I'm fascinated. There was a very rich and diverse history in the Minneapolis, and Jim was there kind of during the golden age of, with Verne and a lot of legends that, several of whom we've had on the show, but it's a real delight, and I'm really happy to have Jim on, if only because I've known so many guys that know Jim, and I've heard nothing but really nice things ever said about Jim. One of the really class acts in the business, and not only a great worker, but a great, citizen in this business. So I'm happy to have him, and looking forward to hearing stories about Verne and Hulk and Jesse and all those guys. It's kind of a colorful era in our business, and very successful. So it should be really illuminating and enlightening.
That's great, and I'd like to introduce the host of today's show. And I met George at the Cauliflower Alley Club. I saw him at the Waterloo, Iowa Dan Gable Museum this past July. Longtime friend. He's a very noted, probably the noted Minnesota wrestling historian. I highly recommend people buy his book, The Minnesota Golden Age of Wrestling, and other publications. Interesting with Jim now, I go back to Winnipeg. I used to be a kind of a fan, you might say, back in Winnipeg, and I'll admit that. I remember hanging out with guys like Jimmy Valiant and Bobby Heenan and Duncan and Nick Bockwinkel and Lenz and all the guys. And when I was in Winnipeg, they had the golden rule. It's called kayfabe, so you would never see the faces and the heels together anywhere. And I did meet Jim Brunzell once at the airport, and I'm not sure if he knew who I was, but they did major kayfabe in those days, so like I say, you'd never see the heels and the baby faces in AWA. But welcome to Hart Beat Radio, George, and always love having you out here sharing perspectives, and I'll let you do the introduction of the Killer Bee and the High Flyer himself, Mr. Jim Brunzell. All yours, George.
All righty. Well, thank you, Bob Johnson and Bruce. Always good to be back on Hart Beat Radio. It's been a few times I've been on, and always had a great time. We do have a great show today. One of the guys that, Bob, you kind of alluded to it, he has been very instrumental from the 70s right up to today in professional wrestling, and we're going to have a chance to talk with Jim Brunzell, who was trained by Greg Gagne, and we're going to have a talk with him, and he's going to share some perspectives with us. So I'm going to introduce Jimmy Brunzell right away. Jim, I'd like to welcome you to Hart Beat Radio.
Well, thanks for having me, God. It's a beautiful day. I talked to both Bobby and Bruce, and it's nice in Calgary, too. It's going to be 70 degrees here. I'm going to, I'll be at the University of Minnesota Golden Gopher football game, and they're playing against Purdue at 2:30. So it's going to be a great day, but it's always fun to talk wrestling, and I'm happy. I talked to Bruce and Bob many times, but for some reason or other never got on, and I'm happy that we got this opportunity. It's always fun talking about wrestling.
Well, and Bruce Hart, member of the famous Hart family, Dad Stu and Bret Hart and Ross and all the others, and it's great that they do this radio show. Jimmy, I'd like to start right from the beginning a little bit with you. You came into professional wrestling in 1972, early 73. And why don't you give listeners that aren't familiar a little bit of a background on how you kind of got connected with wrestling?
Well, George, it was sort of strange. If somebody would have told me when I was 18 years old that I would have had a 25-year career in pro wrestling, I would have said, you're crazy. But when I went to the University of Minnesota as a walk-on for football, it just so happened that another walk-on, my quarterback was Greg Gagne. So Greg and I was a wide receiver, and Greg and I actually teamed together pretty well as a freshman, and we became good friends. And we played our sophomore year together, and then Greg wanted to play quarterback, and he wasn't going to play at Minnesota. They had him at defensive backfield as a safety, so he transferred to Wyoming. So we sort of lost touch for one another, and then after our playing time at college was over, I had a brief tryout with the Washington Redskins in 1971, didn't make it, and wound up coming back. And Greg had called me and said that his dad was going to have a wrestling camp, and Kenny Patera, who was just coming back from the Olympics in Munich, was going to be there, and Bob Bruggers, a former football player from the university and played at the NFL, Khosrow Vaziri, who later gained infamous fame as the Iron Sheik, myself, Greg, and Ric Flair, who turned out to be the Nature Boy. So we had quite a camp, and it was, Billy Robinson did most of the training, and it was it was 6 days a week, 6 hours a day, a lot of calisthenics, and we actually did, and I know Stu and our family were firm believers in conditioning, and we used to do 1,000 Hindu squats before we even started our training every day. So my legs were the biggest thing they ever were after that. But it was quite a deal. And then afterwards, Verne really didn't make us aware of the business in terms of how we were going to be in the ring and what to do and et cetera. So we were all, tight as a doggone monkey wrench, and would beat the crap out of one another as Billy Robinson would do that to us. So finally, I remember they said, okay, your first match, and Verne took us aside and he said, okay, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we call this, and you have to protect your opponent, and your opponent's got to protect you. So, and he made it as competitive as ever. I mean, he was a fellow who stressed being real snug in the ring, and that's the way we all learned. And out of that group, I think, Bob Bruggers, was in an airplane crash, broke his back, and didn't wrestle again. But, I mean, Khosrow, Ken Patera, myself, Greg, and Ric Flair all had a pretty doggone good career in pro wrestling. So, and time flew by, too.
Was Buddy Rose part of that, too? I remember...
No,
Verne.
Buddy was about 3 or 4 years later. And he was another guy, Paul Pershman. Yeah, he was another guy who was just a natural. Him and Ric Flair were about as natural as any two pro wrestlers I've ever come in contact with. They were just, they were just like ducks to water. I mean, they were both extremely, sharp in the ring. Their timing was great. They were good interviewers. They both, Paul Pershman had a career too.
I remember Verne was calling different promoters, including my dad, and I know he sent Khosrow up here, who was pretty much broke in up here, and I heard that Flair mostly headed to the Charlotte area. He didn't seem to have that much of a launch with Verne, but we always used to wonder, like, some incredible talent. He seemed like Verne sent them elsewhere. I know Backlund around that time was contacting my dad, I think maybe through Eddie Sharkey, who I don't think he and Verne were bosom buddies, Eddie and Verne.
No.
Hardly ever did I recall ever hearing my dad discuss the business in a working term with any of these guys. It was all mostly stretching them and seeing if they had any staying power, as he called it. Then, he would put him in the ring if he decided they had paid their dues enough or whatever. And I heard the same about Verne and maybe Dory Funk Sr. and a few of those other old school types. They all had to. My dad always used to say there was like a three-headed dog at the gates of hell that they had to go through before they got to become workers, as they say.
When they trained the wrestlers, they had that attitude that they wanted them to be wrestlers and know how to protect themselves first, and that wasn't always the case in all of the territories of some of the boys that got training. So when you came out of the Verne Gagne camp, you were ready, and it was a matter of then creating your own character, whether it be on the road or whatever you did. Verne had camps just about every other year and brought in so much talent. And I know, Jim, you just expounded on that 72 camp, and that's often been said that it was the greatest camp that Verne ever did. And when you look at the names that came out of it, yours included, I don't think there's an argument in that. Although all of the wrestlers that came out of the Gagne camps over the years, Greg Gagne and I sat down one time and we're coming up with a list of all of the names. And every time Greg would come up with one, I'd come up with two or three that, he said, wow, I forgot all about that guy. And
yeah.
we were up to well over 150 guys. And if you look at the list, every one of them, with but the rarest exceptions in cases like Bob Bruggers, who, his career was cut short in 75.
Right.
But with minor exceptions, every one of those guys were headliners, main eventers, if not in the AWA, in other territories for their careers. And that's just phenomenal. So, Jimmy, go ahead and say what you were going to start with, and then, kind of follow us through, because I know you left the AWA and you went to the Central States territory for a short time right after you started in the business.
Well, I was just going to make a quick comment about when Bill was training us. Cosgrove was always, he was so oriented to amateur style, amateur this, amateur that, amateur this. So Billy and he were in the ring one time, and they were in a wrestling position, and this was sort of cruel and sad that Billy did, but Billy said to Cosgrove, he says, Cosgrove, I'm going to show you the difference between pro wrestling and amateur wrestling. So they're in the wrestling position. All of a sudden, Billy put his hand on Cosgrove's right cheek of his rear and arched his back and came down with a knee and right in the middle of Cosgrove's thigh and kneed him. And honest to God, I thought he broke his leg. And poor Cosgrove just keeled over, and he grabbed his leg, and he was, it was hard for him not to wipe tears from his eyes. And I thought that was pretty despicable of Billy, because, Cosgrove didn't, he was just going along, and, he couldn't help it if for, 25 years he was an amateur. Well, Billy sort of gave him the difference, and honest to God, Cosgrove had a Charlie horse for about 2 weeks after that. But
he was pretty innocent, Cosgrove, as I recall.
Yes,
pretty
very naive. Yeah, I tell you
I
stories
remember
in my book about him. But and from there, they had great talent in the AWA always, and there just wasn't room for us young guys to stay there. So they found a spot for me down in the Central States, where Pat O'Connor and
with Harley
Bob
and that
Geigel.
bunch.
Yeah, and then
Harley was
Gus
still
Karras
champion,
and,
I guess, around that time, so he was touring a bit.
Bob Brown, and it was a Central States champion. And one thing there, Bruce and Bob and George, you wrestled every single day, and then sometimes, most of the time, twice a night, you come out in a single, and then you come back as a tag. So, and we had, everybody drove, and I got to know Mike George. They put he and I against each other.
Nice guy.
And we were both baby faces, and Mike was, he was about 245, 250, and he was a good amateur wrestler from St. Joe, Missouri. So we had 30-minute draws every week, and then finally they decided to put us together as a tag team. And at that time, they had Roger Kirby and Lord Alfred Hayes, who were the Central States tag team champions. And they made a little program for Mike and I, and we wrestled them guys and won the belts. and we just had incredible matches, and it was a great time down there. It really seasons me well, and then also I had the opportunity to see the fellows from the NWA, Jack Briscoe and Terry Funk and Dory Funk and Harley Race would come in, and then, I'd watch them, watch their styles, and Jack Briscoe was an unbelievable champion for the NWA, and
that
Terry
would have been
Funk
a great learning experience. All those guys are among the best.
You sort of, the old adage is, monkey watch, monkey do. Monkey see, monkey do. So you'd pick a little bit from this guy and pick a little bit from that guy, and it was a great experience. And, I think I was down there 10 months, and I think the first 2 or 3 days I lived on hard-boiled eggs and hot dogs and a couple beers because I didn't know anybody. So I think I had a $145 efficiency apartment, and this is no lie. I slept on a blow up air mattress, and if I had people spend the night, like Bob Backlund was coming through town, I had a double mattress for him, and when we filled it up, it was good. And in the morning, he woke up and he was on the bare ground and had a leak in it. But he was on his way to Texas, so he left my apartment with a sore back.
Yeah, it was stuff like that made you kind of appreciate things a bit later on when you kind of half arrived. You kind of had more respect because you had paid your dues. I remember it was kind of the norm back then. 6 or 8 guys sneaking into a hotel room and all pulling the mattresses apart and all that kind of stuff. Or I remember guys sneaking into these all-you-can-eat buffets and having Ziploc bags and throwing shit in it and sneaking them out. And restaurant owners telling my dad, I don't want any of your wrestlers in here anymore. All that kind of stuff,
I remember those all-you-could-eat prime rib buffets, and they were like $12.95, and guys would come in there and eat 2 pounds of prime ribs. And they'd say, okay, we'd appreciate it if you don't come back.
Yeah, it's like sometimes they weren't even that nice about it.
No, that's for sure.
No more wrestlers.
I remember, Jim, when I was living in Winnipeg, all the wrestlers used to stay at the Marlborough Hotel downtown Winnipeg, and right across the street they had this place called the Midtown Buffet. It was all you could eat for $1.99. All you could eat for $99. Eventually became all you could eat for $29.99 or whatever it got. So then they shut down.
Yeah.
But I knew the guy who owned that buffet, so I go in there and he'd say, "Oh, hey, Bob, one of those wrestlers coming in here, they always like coming over to my Midtown Buffet." And I said, "Well, they'll be in next Thursday." So I remember the guy turning around to the cook and said, "When those guys come in, make sure you hide the beef or the meat or something." So
I believe it. Well, a quick story about Winnipeg, Bob. Andre was always nice to me, and I really appreciated his friendship. And I remember one time we were in Winnipeg, and I think it was the Battle Royal season, and I said to Andre, "Listen, I'd like to take you out to lunch. You've been very kind to me." And he said, "Okay, Jim." So there was a real nice little place. It wasn't far from the Marlborough, and it was called a Chez Andre little diner, and it had great, French food and everything like that. So I thought, And I walked in there, and they had a big sign. They said a pork tenderloin, $4.99. And I thought, geez, I can't go wrong with this, And Andre will probably like it. So we sit down, and the waiter comes up and he said, "Andre, would you like to have something to drink?" And he said, "Yeah, I'll have a double Remy Martin." So he had a double Remy Martin. Then we had the meal, and then he ordered a bottle of wine. So I had a Coke, and my meal was $5, and his meal was $5. But the bottle of wine was $95, and then the Remy Martin was $20. So, what you think you'd get by for a $20 meal turned out to be $125. So
that was about half a guy's paycheck in those days.
Yeah,
you know.
I told Andre, I said, listen, I said, next time we go out to lunch, I said, or dinner, I said, I'll buy the food and you can buy the drink. And he said, okay, boss.
One of the things that I think we should touch on real briefly is, now Jimmy's already touched on some of the little happenings on the road, stories and things, and I think it would be a good time to just kind of get that early plug in. Jim, you've got an outstanding book that you came out with last year called Matlands, and I'm going to let you describe it and tell folks how they can get it, and then we'll tell more stories after you're done with that.
Okay, well, I had, when I was just phasing out of my wrestling career, we had, different social activities where my friends we'd go out to dinner and we'd talk and we'd have them over the house. And people, I invariably tell stories from the road, and people say, you should write a book. So my wife, Mary, 42 years, bought me a little dictaphone, and she says, when you think of stories, talk into this. So over a period of probably the last 6 years, I told, all these different stories, and the stories were, good, clean fun. There was no bearing of the axe, and there was no, outrageous sexual events or any horrible drinking escapades or drug use, etc. So I wound up writing this book and self-published it with a company called Blurb, B-L-U-R-B, and it's been out now about a year and 3 months. My wife, I had to have it edited 3 different times because I talk in 1/10 and then I'd switch it and go back. So there was a lot of editing to do, but I can say I wrote every word of it, no ghostwriting, and it more or less chronicles my life from the time I was a young kid whose father was in the Navy and traveled all over the world, to the time when I went to the University of Minnesota, walk-on, played football, and then started my wrestling career, went all through the areas that I wrestled, AWA, the NWA down in both Kansas and North Carolina in the Mid-Atlantic, and then coming back to the AWA, and then leaving in '85, going to the WWF with Vince, and then my career with Vince, and then actually the last couple chapters was talking about my induction into the Wrestling Hall of Fame down in Waterloo, the George Tragos Lou Thez Hall of Fame, which was fun. It was a big honor and a good time. And then the last chapter was just talking about what I'm doing now, and I've been in sales for 17 years with a wonderful company called Delco, and it's family owned. It's funny, it's a small company, but they did $67 million last year. So I was very fortunate to get hired there at age 50, and it provided me with the opportunity to get insurance, which I've needed as from the wrestling career, I had to have a new hip, new shoulder, and new knee. So that always helps to have insurance.
Yeah, very few of them seem to
have
that
stories
these days.
And, your brother, Brett, and Jim Neidhart and Brian and I had great matches, and I had some really good matches with your brother. Both, I think one was in Philly and one was in Madison Square Garden, because we worked both the same way.
They both spoke very highly of you as just a real good team player, and they loved working with you back in I think when they were just getting launched, and they hadn't really kind of ascended to the upper echelons at that time. I remember Brett telling me that he worked a lot with you and Brian, and you guys really were kind of instrumental in kind of getting their careers off the ground down there. Brett said they had been down there for a while, and they weren't sure if they were on their way up or their way down, and they said they had a real good run with you, maybe about 86, somewhere in there, somewhere in that range.
We had, and which which was so good was that we were very competitive in the ring,
and they were
and Brett liked to wrestle,
which
was good. It wasn't just chopping meat. So, and Neidhart, Jimmy would get in there and get the heat, and then it all worked out good. And we had a lot of good tag teams, but I tell you, it was always fun working with Brett because he reminded me so much of the European style, of Jeff Forrest and Les Thornton and Billy Robinson. So, it's a real pleasure to work with him. So please read him for me, Bruce, would you?
I will. He always spoke very highly of you as a wrestler, and even more as just a really decent person. He said there wasn't enough Jim Brunzells in the business, guys that were really just kind of good, honest, give off good energy type people. So.
Well, thank him for that, and wish him the best. And I talked about the WWE and what a contrast it was from, going, when they had 26 different areas to wrestle. Your area in Calgary included, and then all the different territories in the United States. And then all of a sudden, Vince came in 84, I think it was end of 83, 84, 85, and he just sucked all the talent out of all those different...
I spoke to Vince and Shane and whoever. I've told them, it was possibly the worst thing they could have ever done, and I think the business is still suffering. He had kind of like a built-in farm system that he didn't need to subsidize or anything. All he needed to do was, work with guys like Stu or Verne or Bob Geigel or whoever was down in Eddie Graham or wherever, and just let them continue to turn out talent. And it would have been a great thing for Vince to, I see these days when Vince gets these guys who, been there too long, he has no place to send them. But in the old days, it would have been a perfect fit to take some of these guys who, had, been there for a while and send them to Portland or send them to Minneapolis or Calgary and bring them back a year later. And, it was kind of a pretty good system that worked, I think the business is still suffering from that. There's kind of a feast or famine. There's not that many workers. I don't like to be putting them down, but there's not that many guys out there. I see a lot of these guys who get the big push because they're big muscle men, or they get a push, and then you see them drop off the face of the earth a few months later, and that kind of thing. And it's not really a good system. And even NXT, even if they had, I'm mixed about that. They got some few guys have come out of there, but in the old days, one of the things that made the business so good was you'd have these guys like come out of like Verne's territory, like yourself or Cosro or Flair or Buddy Rose, but they would go to another territory, and every territory had a slightly different style. So it was kind of what enriched the business. I remember Verne had guys from Texas and Carolina and Tennessee, and Stu was the same, but it all kind of went into the melting pot, and you'd have we had a lot of guys from England and Japan, like Dynamite and Davey and some of those guys, but it kind of enriched the style. You had a bit of the Japanese and a bit of the English style, and every now and then you'd have a Mexican guy who had a bit of, they had a few high spots and stuff that kind of, and everyone was kind of, kind of interacting and picking up things from different people, and it made for a way more interesting, kind of diverse style, I thought, and so it's kind of one of the things missing these days. You see the more or less the same old style, and see guys doing high spots for no reason other than doing high spots, and everything's
everything's so choreographed, Bruce, and I mean they're down to the T and what to say, and
I remember my dad always used to say there was no orgasm in artificial insemination, which was his way of describing the choreographed stuff,
right. Well, and then Vince wanted to create his own superstars, so he basically changed the whole philosophy of being a wrestling fan, because people became so acquainted with what they saw on TV, which was the only thing on TV then, outside of a couple, whether in whatever it was that came up, NWC, or I can't think of the name of it now, but when Hogan left and they had a couple guys there in Atlanta, but consequently the people, I think the people wouldn't know a good match if they saw one, because when you watch, matter of fact, a friend of mine watched Raw the other night, and he timed it, and in 3 hours, actually had a timer, and the actual wrestling time during that 3-hour program was 7 minutes and 56 seconds.
And probably 6 minutes of it was boring,
Yeah, well, that was, and it's funny because you watch some of these, and I see 3 guys in the ring, and I think, oh my God, and then they have, 8-man tags, and then they got 4, honest to God, and it's just, the biggest thing, Bruce, and I think George and Bob would agree with me, the best thing that Vince's has created was, these guys are making a decent living now. I mean, all the guys, who are there under contract.
It's kind of like feast or famine, that's one of the sad things about the business, if you're in more or less in the mainstream in WWE, you're probably making, pretty decent,
sure.
way more than.
But I think the minimum's, it's either 95 or 110. I think that's what the minimum is.
If you're not in that, then these days you're scrambling. Most of them have to have a day job, and they they get one booking every 2 or 3 weeks, or if that, and they have to pay their own trends, and they, it's kind of a lot of them can't afford to be in the business. There's no like back in the days of the territories, there was maybe nobody was getting rich, but they're all making a decent living, and it was kind of you had a bit of sense of security. You're in a place for 6 months, so you could pay your bills and send a bit of money home and that kind of stuff. But most of the poor guys I don't envy the guys coming in these days. There's not much security, and never been any health care plan for wrestlers or any of that kind of stuff.
No.
So one of the things you guys touch on is, when you talk about no insurance and you talk about the territories, I think the biggest problem with Vince, what happened was when he took away all of the territories. Yeah, you can look at the program today and it is glitzier. It looks better production value. But the sad truth is that there are probably only 100 wrestlers that are going to make any money, and there's no place for them to go if Vince doesn't use them, unless they're on some small indie circuit, which, again, they're not going to make any money, not have a regular schedule. Whereas back in those territory days, you had an opportunity after 6 months, a year and a half in the territory to move on to another territory, learn from new wrestlers. I did a count one time a few years back, and there were probably 3,000 wrestlers that were traveling just around the United States and Canada.
Wow.
And today, we don't have that many. And I wasn't talking about the guys that were doing the television job work. I'm talking about the actual Jim Brunzells and the Billy Robinsons and all the guys. There were like 3,000 of them around the country. And that's the major difference. And when you did get tired or your character or your thing wore out, you moved on to another area.
One of the saddest things to me is the fans themselves. Like, if you're a wrestling fan these days, back in the day, you go every week and watch wrestling out here in Calgary or Portland or Kansas City or Amarillo or Verne's territory or whatever, and you get your fix every week, and you could kind of get into it, and it was a big thing. Nowadays, WWE, they come up here maybe every year and a half, and that's about it. It doesn't kind of satisfy their appetites. It's kind of killed the grassroots. Which is
I think
that's one
thing is that the fan base has changed. It's a different type of fan today than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And it's
if you can even call them fans, I can't recall. Not to be denigrating the people that are out there these days, but for me, it grates on my ears when I hear some idiot going, "Holy shit," or "You fucked up," or that kind of the smart mark mindset. That to me is it more of an annoyance than I don't even consider those people fans. But unfortunately, the tail's wagging the dog because I see the wrestlers trying to oblige those guys by doing high spots and goofy stuff that has really nothing to do with wrestling, but they're trying to oblige the smart marks, as they call them. And it's in the old days, I'm sure Jim would tell you, Billy Robinson or whatever, if you had some fans going boring, they would say, "Screw those people, just go out and work." And
sure.
Or the door bunks and.
I think that the main thing that they have to realize, the guys dictate the match, the fans don't. So they have to take control right off the bat, and a lot of them just, they don't know the hills or beans about, how to build a match. Really, they just try to do what they can. Yeah, there's no psychology.
Pretty pronounced system to it. You'd slowly build up to the big climax, and you'd have the face selling and the heel getting heat, and then finally the face would make the hot comeback. And it was a pretty simple, foolproof pattern, and you had to subliminally allow the marks to feel like their cheering or their booing had some bearing on the outcome and all like that, and it was a pretty simple formula, and I'm not sure why they deviated from it. It kind of it took working out of it, and like we were talking before about the everything being scripted and choreographed. And I remember when I did a few years back, I just guest referee for that so-called match with Brett and Vince, and I was almost amused. They called us in about 6 hours before the match to give us the rundown, and they gave me like a script that had like 30 pages for me as the referee. I was going like, just give me the damn finish, who's going over, I don't need to be.
A couple of years ago, I brought my grandsons, who are now 8 and 11. They love wrestling. They watch it on TV all the time, and anytime I want to know what's going on with the WWE, I ask them. But so I bring them to Minneapolis at the Target Center, and they're having a Raw that night, and Hulk is back there. And this was 2.5 years ago. Vince fired him, etc. And I hadn't seen Terry in probably 10 years. And he had he played Santa Claus that night. He came out of Santa Claus. And he had a 4-page full paragraphs of script that he had to memorize. And I thought, oh my God. And he came out and he did a great job. And I says, holy smokes, Terry. And he said, yeah. He says, that's what it's come to. And I want to say this, I hadn't talked to Hulk since then. So it was 2.5 years. And the other night, I got a phone call from Gene Okerlund in Florida. And he hands the phone over to somebody. And the voice on the other side of the phone said, what are you going to do when Hulkamania runs over you? So I had talked to him, and it turned out that he's well, now that he got that settlement from that Gawker lawsuit, he told me all he's doing is relaxing, and he's buying property in Florida. So the golden goose is replenished a little more gold.
Oh, that's nice to hear. Unfortunately, and sadly these days, way too many who are kind of like the dynamite kid and the down and out and barely struggling to get by. So it's nice to hear of a few guys that are have a little bit of kind of independence financially, and they don't have to go back on the road at 70 years old and take ice spots and all that stuff,
Well, Ric Flair, Bruce, is 68. Yeah, I was going to turn 68. It might have been in October, or maybe it's November, but he's going to be 68, and I saw Rick, and Rick is booked so many times. And the reason being is that, he was in debt, so he had to figure out a way to do this. So they booked him through the WWE, and he's booked constantly. I mean, if he's doing a personal, I remember I was with him at the Comic-Con up at Niagara Falls, and he had 3 shots while he was still at this Comic-Con in 3 days. They flew him to Pittsburgh, and then they flew him someplace else. And then they flew him back, and I think he was getting $10,000 a day at this.
That's nice to hear. I think the saddest ones.
They fly him all over.
The sad ones for me are the guys who don't have enough notoriety to have anyone wanting to book them. That they maybe paid their dues and they were, kind of undercard guys and all like that, but. Those guys are kind of like, I think the tough part about it, Jim, I'm sure you'd agree, it's tough to go back to the real world after you've been.
So, well,
a lot of guys,
Bruce and Bobby and George, we all know it doesn't prepare you for anything. I mean, you lead a pretty sheltered life in terms of what your skills are going to be. So.
And you get a bit spoiled too. You get used to.
You do, and then all of a sudden
sleeping all day and.
I tell a story that when I used to fly and travel, I'd sit next to people and we'd carry a conversation on, and I told them I was a wrestler, and they gave me these business cards, and they said, Jim, when you're done with wrestling, you call us, drop us a line. So when I was done, Vince fired me. And hired me and fired me and hired me and fired me 3 times. And the last time I thought, I had like 30 of these cards that I'd saved. So I wrote to all these people that said, please drop us a line. I wrote a nice letter, and I included a very sketchy resume. And Bruce, I'll tell you this, only one person out of those 30 people answered my letter, and they said, Jim, we're not hiring at this time. So, it's a pretty it's pretty scary. And to be honest with you, there's very few guys that came independent enough so they wouldn't have to go back to work, or you got guys.
It's sad to even though it was fictional, that Mickey Rourke movie, it was unfortunately a lot closer to the truth than.
Unbelievable.
I've seen so many like that, and almost the same. I think I saw Mickey Rourke at one of the WrestleManias down there a few years back, but I said that could have easily been Dynamite Kid or Brian Pillman or
sure.
Any of those guys. Most of them are no longer alive. And they all went down that road, and the drugs, the few ring rats and a few bad investments and a few injuries.
Yeah, it doesn't take much.
All of that, and I bet there's a whole bunch of guys out there right now that are in that boat that are.
Oh gosh, yeah. I'm sure there are, and I talked to Ken Patera. He's still working, and he's 73 or 74, and Cosmos all crippled up, and
there's not too many. There's no safety net or no pension plan or no.
None
of that.
There isn't. Yeah.
Well, it'd be nice.
It's funny in my book I cover this and talk about the reality of coming into the real world after you've been sheltered by wrestling and I tell a lot of stories and I'll tell you this really brief story about Khosrow. And we were going to Minot, and there was 5 of us in this car, and it's about 520 miles, I think, from Minneapolis to Minot, and we had to wrestle there. And at that time, we had a lot of guys, great talent. We had Billy Superstar Graham, we had Wahoo McDaniel, I think Ivan Koloff, Mad Dog Bashan, Horst Hoffman, and there might be a spread of years here, but there was so many guys. And as we were driving down the road, Dick Murdoch and Dusty Rhodes pull by in the El Ranchero, and they see that we're just jammed in this car, so they stop us and they said, "Hey, we'll put one of you guys in the box in the back of the El Ranchero." So Khosrow said, "Okay, I'll do it." So they wrapped him up, and he looked like the Michelin Man. So we got 100 miles left to go. Minot, and Dick Murdoch is driving. And so we take off, and he's going 80 to 100 miles an hour, and he's going right and left on the freeway, and then he's pumping his brakes. So Khosrow is literally a pinball in the back of this box, a 6 foot by 4 foot box, and then Dick had slowed down a little bit, and then Khosrow crawl to the front and look at the window, and he'd try to tap the window, and then Dick would put the gas on again, and Khosrow would go ass over tea kettle and go backwards, and we laughed, and it was very unchristian-like. We laughed in the car for about an hour, and then finally we were getting to the outskirts of town, so they pulled over, and here Khosrow. It was about 40 degrees outside, and they were going 100 miles an hour easy. So Khosrow's all bundled up, and he gets back in the car, and he's shivering. And he said, hey, this is what he says. He says, Dickie Murdoch, Dusty Rhodes, they play bad joke on Khosrow. But, it was stuff like that people don't believe, but it happened.
That was the norm,
Yeah.
I know there was all kinds of that stuff up here, some of the guys, the Bulldogs were pretty bad with every kind of thing, from the Metamucil Slurpees to the, the X-Lax hot chocolate to the, all that kind of stuff. There were always some kind of, and some of it was half dangerous. It landed guys in hospitals with, their intestines bursting and
and
stuff
I love
like
Davey
that.
Boy. Davey Boy and Tommy were really great guys and fun to work with. And I remember, they had a real good run with Gary Taylor, who fancied himself like Ric Flair. He dressed
the Red Rooster
to the
thing,
nines. Yeah, and then Davey and Tommy would, when Terry was in the ring, they'd go into his locker, pull his pants out, and, he had $85 Sandsville pants. And then they take a pinking shears and they cut off about 4 inches of his inseam, So Terry Taylor would come back and put his pants on. It looked like he had capris on, like Bermuda shorts. And this went on for about a month, and then they finally, Vince had to tell. He says, "Please," he says, "don't do this anymore." And Davey Boy was such a
I think
great
that
guy.
ended up being Dynamite's undoing down there with the Cowboy Boots and Rougeau and
that was sad.
I know they told me they did one on this hapless misfit named Outback Jack, where they I'm not sure. They told me that they gave him some kind of Halcyon or one of the something like that, and then I think they shaved his head and threw his suitcase out the window, and I thought it was in California or something, and he woke up the next afternoon and had missed his flight and had I don't think he had any earthly belongings. His wallet and everything was gone. And
I know some of those ribs were pretty cruel, and they were funny, but sometimes they got a little beyond.
Oh yeah, you didn't want to be the recipient. It was.
Oh God! I remember one time I caught Davy Boy. We're in Maryland, and I'd come back from my match, and I was coming back from the shower, and I had a hooded jacket because it was cold, and he was filling my hood with shaving cream, and I said, Davey, what are you doing? He says, oh, nothing, Jim. And he walked away, and I had about a cantaloupe size of shaving cream in my hood, so I just scooped it out and took my towel out and didn't think anything of it. But yeah, those guys were characters. But you gotta realize we were on the road. You know, there was 60 guys. They ran 3 towns a night. This is WWE. 20 guys in each town, and for 3 years, I averaged 27 days a month. So we were gone 27 days a month. There was a lot of guys. I mean, Cosro, he worked 89 days or 92 days in a row, and by the time he got home, he drove by his house because his wife took the money and redecorated the house, and he didn't recognize it, so he drove right by it. I mean, that's sad to say, but that was true.
Yeah.
Oh, God. Well, you know, I'm going to have to leave here pretty quick, but I just wanted to get one more plug in about this book, Madlands, and I know, George, you've, read it, and you've given me, wonderful recommendations. I appreciate that, and I know, Bruce, you got it, but, it's at this blurb, BLURB, and .com, and if you just punch that in and then punch Matlands, MATLANDS, and I got to go now. They just waved me here, so I really appreciate the opportunity. Also I want to add this, Bruce. I had such a wonderful time with Owen. He was a great guy. It was just a tragedy that his life was taken so soon. And I just enjoyed him. He was a wonderful person, a great worker, kind-hearted guy, and I couldn't see enough about him. And thank you very much to you, Bobby, and George. I'll see you down the line. And take care. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate your joining us today, Jim. It's great to hook up with you again, and continued success with the book and everything else. And just as Brett and Owen said, nothing but a class act. I wish there was more guys like you in our business. So, all the best and God bless.
Bruce and Bob, I want to say, Jimmy had pointed out to go to blurb.com for his Matlands. And, just briefly, he touched on what the real contents of his book are. And I know, Bruce, you probably have it, and Bob, you do too. This is a fun book about those travels on the road, behind the scenes, things that the guys talked about and did on the road, talks about some of the pranks. There's that old story that, and we got to remember that back in his day, there wasn't as much flying as there is today. So these guys would hop in, as they said, an Oldsmobile 98. They'd put 6 guys in it, and they'd take off down the road to do 200, 300, 400 miles to get to the next town. And your best friend's in that car. That's all you've got for all those miles. And there's a lot of friendships that were forged. And the stories in Matlands are really, really worth for any fan that wants to know about those really golden days of the 70s and the 80s that Jimmy wrestled. So I encourage you to do it. Jimmy shared many of the stories with me when he was writing the book. He would email me a story. He'd say, what do you think of this? Is this too risque? Should I put this in there? And I gave him a nod on about 90% of what he sent me. I said, do it. And, you could, like he said, he doesn't put any sleaze or anything in there, so it's not something that you have to worry about hiding the book. It can sit on the coffee table at home, and everybody can read it. But it's a really, really good book. And what a class guy Jim Brunzell is. Wow.
Is there some pictures in it too, George?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Jim has pictures from his own collection, and I will add that was another thing that I was honored on. Jimmy sent to me for several pictures from my collection of some of the guys that he didn't have photos of. But aside from that, they are included. But he has many of his own personal family photos in there, some personal wrestling photos that were taken. And I got to say, too, you know, he just touched on this when he said that his wife, Mary, did the book, edited the book. And Mary did such a great job. She did so much work on it, had to do it over, get it right. And her heart was in this so much. And she, you know, you can just feel the love that she has for Jim. There's pictures of them together, talks about their family life together. And Jimmy hinted that he was married 42 years. I've been out with these folks, Mary and Jim Brunzell, socially and at wrestling events, and I will tell you, you can't find two nicer, more genuine, sincere folks as Jim and Mary Brunzell. So you got
I know that's certainly what Brett and Owen always used to tell me. That Jim, they spoke very highly of Brian Blair too, I might add, but they always told me that. They always told me that Jim was just a really genuinely nice guy, you know, and always a good guy to have in the dressing room or on the road, you know, and always a smile on his face and, you know, giving off good energy. So, you know, I've never heard a bad thing ever said about Jim Brunzell. So,
you know, the thing is, Bruce, there are so many times when you're watching your heroes, no matter what the sport is, and you see them, you see the persona that they give you or present to you during their football game or their wrestling match or whatever it may be. And there are times when you finally get to meet them and you realize that what they were doing was they were just schmoozing up to you and they don't want anything to do with you. They're not the same person that you envision them to be. But Jim Brunzell,
backstabbing, ass-kissing degenerates, you know.
Yeah. And
unfortunately.
Jim Brunzell and so many like him, they are just genuine, decent guys who they appreciate the fans. They understand that it was the fans that paid them. And they understand that the fans were the reason that they had any success at all, and they're always there to talk with them. And Jimmy will do that anytime you run into him. He did tell me earlier this week that he has the Gopher game to go to today, and that's going to be starting in just a few minutes here. So he's on the road to get there. He enjoys his Gopher football.
Yeah, I'm delighted to have had both you guys on, you know, and you're one of the few guys, George, who has been able to capture the whole huge chapter in the history of our business, that Minneapolis and that whole thing, you know. So, you know, I certainly highly recommend any of your publications too. You know, the fans, you know, owe it to themselves to check that out too, because Minneapolis was like, as Verne used to call it, the major leagues of professional wrestling back in the 70s or whatever. You know, it was a really prolific and prodigious.
I would point out to you when you say Minneapolis, you know, it was always known as the Minneapolis Territory, but the Minneapolis Territory was the AWA, and before the AWA, it was actually NWA promoted up until 1960. But it was the Minneapolis office where all the booking came out of, where all the wrestlers worked for. So when they say Minneapolis, they're talking AWA. And if you'd like to
Denver and Chicago and Milwaukee and Winnipeg and
Denver,
that whole area. Yeah, it was. But yeah, I'd love to have. I'll have Bob set it up another time, George, just where you could maybe even regale us with just sort of a retrospective of the AWA. You know, was one of the.
It's a very rich and fun story. I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
I was going to say, George,
sometime on the road.
George, I just want to let you know, I can tell you a little quick story about my involvement with the AWA back in Winnipeg. That's actually how I got involved sort of with Stampede. I don't know, it's a long story, but anyway, I was a young guy in Winnipeg, more, again, I'm going to call myself a fan, I guess. And I remember...
fans, Bob.
I'm a fan.
We all
I don't know, anyway.
Yeah,
I'm still a big fan, anyway. I remember I had right near the Winnipeg Arena, I had a little convenience store, and every 3 weeks, the guys would come into my convenience store on the way to the Winnipeg Arena and buy mix and cigars and snacks and stuff like that. And the guys who actually came in, remember Jimmy Valiant, Johnny Valiant, Maurice Vachon, the Baron, and all the heels for some reason came into my store. And then I remember one time they said, why don't you join us and come on the road sometime? So I actually went on the road with on a whim. The next day I flew down to I think we went to Bismarck and then Denver, and then I went over to Minneapolis, and I thought that was a kind of a cool thing. I remember Bobby Heenan was on that road trip, and I have some really good memories of Winnipeg. But I want to mention one story about Winnipeg wrestling. Winnipeg was one of the hottest wrestling centers in the planet at one time. I remember it was in the middle of January. I can't remember what year. It was in the 70s sometime. And they had the promo. I think it was Roger Kent was doing the promo. It was Mad Dog Vachon against the Crusher. Brought this cage on the TV screen, and I'll never forget, Crusher brought this tomato on there, and he said, this is what I'm going to do to Maurice Vachon in Winnipeg Arena. So it ends up, it was, I think they had around 12,000 people at the Winnipeg Arena in minus 30 below zero. And I'll never forget, they turned away about 4,000 people at that event. And I was fortunate. I had a ticket, and I watched that cage match. So that was always a lot of fun. AWA would come in there about every 3 weeks, and they'd pack the arena. Big crowd, huge business.
Well, we didn't have a chance to talk with Brunzell about this, but back on July 7th of 1977, that was the night that Jim and Greg Gagne defeated Blackjack Lanza and Bobby Duncombe for the AWA Tag Team Championship. And that took place in Winnipeg. So there's a good memory for you there. Kind of an interesting story with Bob Duncombe is he was one of the very few guys that Verne Gagne was never able to get a victory over. Verne never put himself over Bobby Duncombe. They had some disqualifications and that sort of thing, but Verne never beat Bobby Duncombe outright. And to me, that always showed a sign of respect because Verne wasn't always that gracious. He was going to make sure that no matter who the talent was, that in the end, he was going to be the victor. And he was. And Bob Duncombe, the records show, though, that Verne never, just never hurt Bobby Duncombe in the ring. So there had to be some great respect there for him.
I would personally highly recommend that you buy a copy of the Minnesota Golden Age of Wrestling book by George Schire. Probably the best book I've read in recent times about Minnesota wrestling and wrestling in general. And I think, George, you've got some other publications out. Am I correct?
I do have. Let me just say thank you for plugging my book. I want to point out to fans again that it's called Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling, and the name Minnesota in the title was specifically done on the book because the book is published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press, which is the Minnesota History Center in St. Paul. And so because it's a Minnesota-based publisher, they wanted the name Minnesota in the title. But Minnesota, in this case, means the AWA and the NWA history before that for the Minneapolis Wrestling Office. The book can be purchased at bookstores, Barnes & Noble, or you can go on to Amazon.com and get a copy. The other two books that I have out are the AWA record books. They're complete listings of wrestling cards that took place along with pictures and side notes about those cards. Both of those are available on Amazon.com, and I had the assistance of my good buddy Mark James, who did all the layout and formatting the book and everything, so Mark gets credit for that. But AWA record book, the 60s, and AWA record book, the 70s, they're available on Amazon.com.
We're now in season 4, one of the most popular shows on the on wrestling as far as a podcast. And we want to thank our friends from Portland Wrestling. We have a new alliance with Portland Wrestling, namely Matt Mers.
I wish there was more like Matthew out there.